Welcome to Next in Tech, an S&P Global Market Intelligence podcast where the world of emerging tech lives. I'm your host, Eric Hanselman, Chief Analyst for Industry and Company Data at S&P Global Market Intelligence. And today, we're going to be digging into the NVIDIA GTC conference with 451 founder John Abbott, who is out there at the conference. John, welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, Eric. Thanks very much for having me back.
And thanks for being back. A very interesting conference this year. Interesting to see the evolution. What's your take on what was going on?
Well, I think I've been to pretty much every GTC conference since 2009 when they really started having them. And to start with, it was all gaming, which wasn't really much to do with my coverage area, really. And they used to show the latest games on the screen and rhapsodize about ray tracing.
Shaders and all those other kinds of heavy-duty computations, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And I'm not much of a gamer either, so it sort of went way over my head. But anyway, they were always looking to broaden their market opportunities, and over the years it moved on to things like design automation. Then, do you remember GPU virtualization and remote graphics and all that? And then the term GPU, general purpose GPU. So they were always looking for the opportunities, and it got more and more into enterprises and high-end supercomputing. And they looked at parallel processing, but they never call it that because they felt that was too complicated and would put people off. And then machine learning and deep learning, and none of that was very long ago either, really. It's and I think there's something sort of surprisingly unassuming in the fact that NVIDIA stays at the San Jose Convention Center, which is where they always ran their stuff. It's now heaving when you go into the show itself because it's too small for 25,000 people. And they have to outsource the keynote to the local hockey stadium.
Well, it's the only place to be able to hold enough people. But absolutely,
and they called it actually this time the Super Bowl of I don't know, AI, the Super Bowl of AI. Anyway, and when you were at the stadium, it did feel like that a bit, actually. But anyway,
it speaks to really what's happened was this very niche-y, nerdy kind of thing that was the graphics processing unit community.
That's right.
And NVIDIA is the provider, and
it always felt a bit like a sort of cottage industry in those days, even though it's quite a big market, but nothing like now. And now it seems NVIDIA still wants to remember its roots, so it's not actually moving from San Jose. But even though I did hear that they did try to book up the Globe in Las Vegas, but couldn't because it's fully booked. So.
This is one of the challenges of growth. Well, and they've been on this up and down journey. There was this big boom during cryptocurrency when suddenly GPUs were needed to mine Bitcoin, and then that fell away, and then suddenly this crazy little thing called AI happened.
Yeah, and it's still actually quite a vibrant show, I think, because it's still basically developers. So I remember back to Java 1, which was really exciting for the first 10 years, and then it declined into a sort of morass of nothingness.
Well, interestingly enough, I've got some research coming up because I was at the reinvigorated Java 1, which they haven't had since.
I saw that was on up the shore, Redwood Shores. Yeah,
exactly, just a little north of San Jose in Redwood Shores. Yeah.
So how's it nowadays? Is it reinvigorated?
It is very much so. Java turned 30 this year.
Right.
But again, very much developer focused, something that I guess maybe Java 1 aspires to the same kind of growth that the GTC is dealing with.
It's just that at its peak, it was a huge show. It was a huge, massive show. And then Java became slightly less central to things. I know it's still there and will be forever. But it then disappeared really effectively. And I think GTC is at that sort of peak stage now. So it'll be interesting to see whether next year it's up or down. And I suppose that depends on quite a few other factors.
But the conference itself has that developer centricity to it.
Yeah,
although, of course, now everyone on the planet wants to figure out what they're going to do and what's taking place beyond just the developer community.
Absolutely, and that's what I felt was really interesting, because I think CEO Jensen Huang was actively aware of NVIDIA's place in the Magnificent Seven stocks and it's the responsibilities which go with that. So he said, for instance, he called out in particular the response to DeepSeek in January. The general response was completely wrong, and he was really aggressive about it, really, for him, because he's a very sort of laid back person, really. I mean, the narrative then was that new ways of building models would mean less demand for GPU clusters in the future.
And for those of
And
our
he,
listeners who hadn't heard, the DeepSeek model developed in China in an environment in which access to GPUs was constrained, actually went out and did a whole bunch of optimization, both
yeah,
primarily in training, and built a model with a lot less GPU requirements, simply because they were operating in an environment where they had to do those optimizations. And the stock market wiped $1 trillion or so worth of valuation off a whole bunch of different companies, in worry that, in fact, this was going to stunt the growth of all of the technologies that were associated with it, and in the process, take a lot of value away from those who are building infrastructure to run AI. Now coming on a couple months later, there seems to be general agreement that no, we're still going to need lots of AI infrastructure to support all this. But interesting to see that Jensen was out there reaffirming that this is really where they are.
yeah, and his argument was just that you'll always need more GPUs, even if things get more and more efficient. And it brought me to mind of the VMware situation, when VMware came out and said, right, we're consolidating all these servers, and you won't need so many servers in the future. But that didn't work out. We had to buy even more servers because of VMware. So. But also I mean, I spoke to quite a few staff members at NVIDIA, and it sort of burned in their brain this event on the 20th of January, which they called DeepSeek Monday. So they obviously found it quite
Oh
a
dear.
traumatic experience. After months and maybe years of sort of uninterrupted growth, suddenly they saw their share price go down.
Well, it's been interesting watching the overall reaction, because, of course, there was that very dramatic market reaction, and then all of the back and forth around it, having to go back to economics textbooks,
Yes,
to the point at which suddenly everybody is quoting Jevons paradox,
that's right.
from the Industrial Revolution, of if you make the consumption of something more efficient, you will in fact not reduce the consumption of it, but in fact accelerate it, because it's now less expensive to consume.
Exactly.
It's been a wild ride.
But also in the keynote, Jensen spent at least 30 minutes of his time talking about the maths of tokens per query, and how tokens are the main means by people who invest lots and lots of money in GPU infrastructure can claw some of that investment back. So he spent a long time going through the maths of that, and how the shift from knowledge-based models, which typically deliver a one-shot response to a prompt based on pre-trained data, is now shifting towards this chain of thought reasoning models, where the problem is broken down into multiple stages that hone the eventual answer and confirm its accuracy from multiple sources. And that process generates a lot more tokens at every stage. I think he was talking about hundreds of tokens for those kind of queries, rather than a single one for a one-off shot thing. I mean, that sounds a bit like a justification for spending lots of money on GPU infrastructure, but that he felt that was important to do that in the keynote, which is normally focused on technical things.
Well, and interesting to identify that there's a shift from that what he's calling out is this shift towards being able to get good answers. It was interesting hearing him talk about it. I caught the replay. It was interesting hearing him talk about that and getting very specific about, this is what really effective AI is going to require, and then saying, yep, it requires more tokens, but this is, and calling out specific examples about, look, you can ask it questions, and you can get an answer, but if you want something that is going to have depth and accuracy, then you really need to go to the next level of AI reasoning, getting into reasoning and reason-based approaches to be able to actually deliver this. To your point, really sort of doubling down on this idea that this is where we're headed, and that consumption is driving this.
Absolutely. And I suppose the sort of main headline of the GTC show was the launch of Blackwell Ultra, which is the sort of enhanced memory version of Blackwell, which was announced last year's GTC, but has only really just recently begun sort of fully shipping. It's now fully shipping. He assured us, and Ultra will come a bit later. And he also talked about some of the rack models, the 72 NVL 72, which has got 36 Grace CPUs and 72 Blackwell B200 GPUs in it. So there's really huge rack scale systems. And I always think, and it was confirmed multiple times at the show, that NVIDIA is not a chip company, it's a systems company, and it's now a systems and a software company as well, which is another big focus of the show.
Well, it's interesting watching, because GTC, as you were pointing out, started out as a developer environment, which is, how do you get the most out of, your GPU environment? How do you code around them? How do you build applications with them? All those pieces to this, and that's evolved from NVIDIA just simply being a semiconductor device manufacturer to now one that supports a very large software effort. If you take a look at how they're optimizing models specifically for the CUDA software architecture, and of course enhancing the CUDA software architecture, this is no longer just a device pipeline. This is all of the software that wraps around it. Now, these massive DGX systems that, well, some massive, some small, but DGX systems that actually are built around them. So full built platforms around this. We're in a very different place.
Yeah, and on the software point, really, CUDA didn't get that much of a look in terms of new developments, but he really did emphasize how much it continues to be an enabler. I mean, they're talking about 6 million developers now, and 900 CUDA X libraries, that's AI related libraries that are available for people to, so they don't have to start from scratch on everything from physics, data science, deep learning, quantum chemistry, weather, medical imaging, and all that. And then on the business
that whole panoply behind him of all of the libraries that they've now.
That's right, which was pretty impressive, I thought. But then also on the business side as well, the less sort of glamorous side, if you like, not just the huge high performance computing science projects that are going to save the planet or reduce disease or whatever, but real sort of business things. And they everywhere at the show was this NVIDIA AI Enterprise product with all the systems integrators, Accenture, EY, Deloitte, and systems and storage companies like Dell, HP, and Nutanix, all showing this thing off. With the various boxes of NVIDIA software components and then their own tacked on alongside it. So that product has AI frameworks, application blueprints, and the NIM container where they actually package up these applications and make them easier to deploy, just like a container. So that was a much bigger emphasis than I've seen in the past on just sort of workaday software that's AI enabled, as if NVIDIA is really concerned that this stuff is not just shelfware or it's not just fueling the infrastructure build out without actually making sure that people are actually using this stuff for real world things at the same time.
Well, and expanding that ecosystem across all of these various ecosystem players, storage players, server players. I mean, the fact that you got Michael Dell up there, it really speaks to the extent to which this has become a much larger ecosystem.
Yeah. I mean, another thing I thought was really interesting is they opened up their roadmap. So for four years ahead, and they claimed that this was something I'm not sure, but they said that most people don't go that far out, and certainly Intel doesn't. Goes a certain distance. And AMD is a bit more secretive, I would say, about what's coming up next. But they laid it out for 4 years with the Vera CPU and Rubin GPU ahead, and then beyond that. The Feynman.
Yes,
is the generation.
Richard Feynman.
Yeah,
it's continuing that process of identifying various luminaries in various fields, but computing and physics. But yeah.
I mean, the people who are investing, especially the GPU clouds, of which there are 7 or 8 there at the show floor, they do need to know that there's a roadmap and how it all fits together and what they're going to do in the future.
Well, because they are in a world now where they have existed, where there hasn't been a lot of strong direct competition. But now there is. You've got AMD coming out with the MX300i and all of its family beyond that. You've got a whole set of potential new semiconductor companies that are all looking at being able to capture some of that massive market. But if you look at where NVIDIA is, because it is such an ecosystem play, because there is so much to it, it's going to be difficult to displace.
Absolutely. They built a moat around CUDA and all its ecosystem, and that's really hard to break into. So AMD, I would say, has got credible technical products, but it's much weaker on the software side of things. And it's an effort for people to use an alternative to NVIDIA because they have to start reinventing the rest of that software stack as well. Jensen was very funny in a session that he had with the analysts where people asked about some of the alternatives, and he went on a bit of a rant about APU, BPU, CPU, DPU, saying splitting all these AI functions into sort of more discrete devices. He said that's stupid, and he thought GPU is stupid as well. So he started talking about what is a graphics processor. It's not graphics. It's not really general purpose. But he basically said it's the software and the programmability of that hardware that really is the distinctive feature that you've got to worry about.
It's not what it is; it's what you can do with it.
Yeah. So that was great. And where he ended up in the end, he started physical AI and robotics was sort of left at the end of the keynote. And it didn't get that much of a mention because it's still quite a long way out, really. But he claimed that physical AI is where everything is ultimately heading. And things like Omniverse, which NVIDIA started talking about 4 or 5 years ago and hasn't really done very much yet. But he's still pushing that as the sort of operating system for digital twins, where you get all this information in and start really utilizing it for design before you actually build the products and everything like that. And Cosmos, which is the framework for physics aware framework, so it knows the properties of all these materials and how they should react. And they introduced a new Newton physics engine as well, which was developed in conjunction with Google and Disney Research. So all that's still sort of going along, and he's really saying that's where the end point is, and we're building intelligence into all these different vertical markets, and that's why AI is a big deal. And where the value will be ultimately.
Well, because he was on stage with a robot, granted a cute little one, courtesy of Disney. But I thought, you make an important point, which is that this is where that journey is headed. And there are a lot of pieces that have to come into play. The idea of digital twins and being able to effectively train and simulate in digital environments. This is something that Ian Hughes has been talking about quite a bit in terms of being able to build digital environments in which to train, so that if you have a robot, if you have an autonomous vehicle, whatever that thing happens to be, you've got the ability to now spin it up and train it in a virtual world that responds in the way that the real world would respond, that you have digital twins of the kinds of things that you're interacting with, and use that as a way to more efficiently train your whatever your particular product happens to be, and to leverage it that way. And it seems like we're finally starting to get to that convergence of an understanding of the needs for physical environments and where they have to be able to both interact and train. And the other thing I thought was really interesting that he commented on was the need for data around all this.
Yeah.
And the challenges that most organizations face in data.
Yes, and in fact, they didn't go into it very much, but they've got a sort of storage framework which they're working on with all the storage companies as well, and a lot of those storage companies I spoke to at the show they wouldn't go into many details, but they said yes, we're working with NVIDIA on this, on getting that software stack a bit more tuned for AI, so that you can feed the GPUs with the data you need.
Well, yeah, it's something that we've talked about on a number of different episodes, which is getting to that next stage of having a data pipeline as opposed to an application development pipeline.
Yeah.
And what's necessary for that. And being able to get the right data and at the right scale that is robust enough. I mean, the data part of this starts to become pretty significant. And we keep saying, in AI, the data is the application.
Yeah.
You've got to be able to get, beyond that idea of data is the stuff that we've just sort of stored, to data really is the, what we're building the end result on top of.
Yeah, absolutely. And another area related to that is the networking side, really. And I think during the conference I heard for the first time that Ethernet will probably be the ultimate outcome for its network, even though they've got InfiniBand and they're not giving up with it in any way. They for the big scale out, they're looking at Ethernet, the Spectrum switches.
Well, so how long ago? I should have looked this up. That NVIDIA acquired Mellanox, a networking provider that was one of really the key proponents of InfiniBand. And its own special, low latency, high performance interconnect, in competition to Ethernet.
Yes,
but
all the clouds use Ethernet, all the big clouds really, and they don't really want to have two separate stacks. So I think ultimately they'll push for that. The other thing about networking that came up at the show was this co-packaged optics, where you reduce the expense of power-hungry optical transceivers by actually integrating that onto the chip, which they've been working on with TSMC, and that could take out a lot of power requirement and a lot of the cost of optical networking inside the cabinets.
The networking part of my heart was near and dear to me there. The idea that because the challenge, of course, is that we've had optical interconnects, once you got outside the semiconductor world, but that everything that was within, and we're now environments in which you've got chiplets, in which you've got GPUs and memory and all sorts of things all crammed onto lead frames or interposers or packaging, but the interconnect is all electrical at really high speed, which of course is flinging all those electrons around, takes a lot of energy. And if we could do that optically, we cut down a lot of the power requirements. We also, as a result, cut down the heat dissipation, so that so many of these devices now are in the hundreds of watts in a package. If we could start to roll that down, now we get to package them closer together. It uses less energy. All these other good things that start to compound on top of themselves.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the couple of things that they didn't really talk about very much, and that is, despite all we've been saying, there still could be a pullback from some of this AI infrastructure build up because it's going on at an incredible pace, and that's a big danger, I think, for NVIDIA. You know, with alternative models coming up, they're using different techniques. So they didn't really talk too much about that. And then the other thing they didn't talk about at all, really, was geopolitics, and I think that's because Jensen is a very unpolitical sort of person. He really doesn't want to get involved in that stuff. But there's so much going on there. You know, all the tariffs which could affect Nvidia's fabulous semiconductor business model, which it's based around. All the uncertainty around that, and even more so, I think, the environmental issues of this massive build out and what that really means longer term. And I felt they didn't really address that. If things go on at even greater momentum, where will all the required energy come from, and at what price to the planet?
A good question, and actually something we've talked a lot about on the podcast, and those concerns about where does this go, and what does that growth rate look like? And again, getting back to the device power efficiency, hey, maybe optical buys you back some of that, but it is that question of we keep building and building and building, and all those electrons have got to come from somewhere. So
They are definitely addressing, the efficiency as much as they can, but no manner of. Well, I think all the efficiencies are really going to come from software, and I think Nvidia should maybe. Well, I'm sure they are, but maybe they should talk a bit more about how they're trying to get these software efficiencies to reduce the hardware level, which in some ways is counterintuitive to their business model of throw hardware at it.
well, but it is something that they've already invested significantly in. So they spend a lot of time optimizing models so that they run most efficiently on NVIDIA GPU hardware. So they've got certainly a vested interest to identify that, and it is interesting to have Jensen talking about token consumption, because again it's been that question of how do you actually monitor usage. What is
Yes.
that metric? And we're starting to get to a world in which organizations are looking to manage efficiency. You've got basically all of the AI platform folks that are out there: IBM, Red Hat, Microsoft. Everybody talking about more efficient models. Taking a step back a little bit from trillion parameter models,
Yeah.
and looking at efficiency and optimization. And DeepSeek, as we were talking about, certainly was one, I guess, major milepost in terms of thinking about efficiency. So,
Yeah.
clearly more to be done. Is that question of whether or not developers are willing to sacrifice some level of speed for efficiency.
That's
And
right.
yeah, interesting. So, what do you see in the looking a little bit ahead? Where is this going to be something that the repercussions from GTC are pretty well much shaken out, or is there more that should be rolling out over time?
Well, I mean, I think their roadmap is quite nice and clear, and it seems fairly solid that they're going to try and do this yearly cadence of new introductions. I think there was a bit of a schism there as to whether this will affect their previous GPUs. So Jensen was talking about, oh, you don't want to buy a Hopper anymore because Blackwell is so much better, and he joked about himself being the chief revenue disposer or something along there. But actually, when you talk to companies, they want as much hardware as they can get, and they're still quite a few of them are still pretty happy with Hopper. So I suppose it's how they follow through on this roadmap and broadening out their software stack to become almost like a VMware of AI, which seems to be the direction where they're heading. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that plays out.
At least as long as they're not the Intel of AI.
That's right. And with Intel now struggling for multiple reasons, it really has cleared the way for NVIDIA in this accelerated AI, which they're now saying everything is accelerated. So if you haven't got an accelerator, you're irrelevant. And that's implied their opinion.
Well, it certainly seems to be the wave that is coursing through the markets as we stand today. But, well, thank you, John. This has been great. Certainly a lot more to look towards as this continues to roll out.
I think so. Yes.
Well, so much more to discuss, but we are at time for this episode. Thanks to our audience for staying with us. And thanks to our production team, including Sophie Carr, Faran Mudayashin, Kira Smith, and Adam Kowalski on the marketing and events teams. I hope you'll join us for our next episode, where, not surprisingly, we're going to be looking at something that's also tied in AI, but on the data side. Paige Bartley will be on talking about privacy, data exposure risks, and the regulatory environment that sits around AI. I hope you'll join us then, because there is always something next in tech.